Good evening and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature podcast. I'm Nate and I'm joined by my co-hosts Gretchen and JM. How are you doing tonight, guys?
I'm doing good.
Yeah, I'm doing good. It's a perfect day to be recording a podcast about the Arctic because we have had a massive blizzard up here. Everything is closed. So, yeah. Although we've been learning some interesting things about the Arctic, including that it doesn't snow that much in some regions. But yes, it's really coming down today, and it stopped now, but it's windy as hell. So it's nice to be inside talking about exploration to the poles.
Yes, and it's a very nice set of January stories that we have for you tonight. One of the reasons why we decided to cover this set of stories dealing with the Arctic and the Antarctic is at the time when most of these stories were written, the Antarctic and to a lesser extent the Arctic were largely unknown to European and American explorers. The Arctic had been habited since the times of prehistory, but the Antarctic was a completely different story in that it is surrounded by a great deal of water and was largely unreachable by humans until relatively modern times. Now, we're not going to go into a great deal of history about Arctic and Antarctic exploration, as I think that will come up in at least two of the stories we'll be reading tonight. But we just wanted to mention that the reason that we're covering these stories is that they are a very interesting precursor to space exploration fiction, and that Star Trek's tagline is "Space, the Final Frontier." The frontiers of the poles had not been completely sketched out yet, so there was a great deal of speculation at what might be there. And I think a lot of these nautical themes translate very well into starship exploration when they're going into the unknown and they're encountering all these weird phenomenon. So while we might have a greater understanding of what's there today, that wasn't the case in the 19th century when these works were from. So I guess with that brief intro aside, let's go into our first work that we'll be covering tonight, written by a Mr. Edgar Allan Poe.
As anybody who's listened to the Chrononauts podcast before will know, we have covered Mr. Poe on several occasions already, and it brings me great delight to discuss his one and only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. This book was serialized, at least in part, not in full, but it was serialized in the Southern Literary Messenger starting in July 1837. This issue also included a lengthy review of Jeremiah Reynolds' work, Expedition to the Pacific Ocean and South Seas. Jeremiah Reynolds is somebody we briefly discussed before in our episode on the Hollow Earth stories, and there's actually a lot of crossover in those kind of stories and what we're going to talk about today. And it's quite interesting, actually, the way everything sort of connects together in a lot of ways. Many of the stories that we do on this podcast could fit into multiple themes. I mean, we have been kind of trying to adopt a thematic approach for the most part, and it works out pretty well, but I might as well mention now that we're not putting aside the nautical themes, which are all over this episode, because next episode we are going to do a Weird Sea episode, and some of this stuff could fit in there as well. There's, again, the Hollow Earth stuff. It's all sort of connected around this time. So Poe wrote this, and I know obviously he had a very large body of work, and everybody knows his fiction and his poems. He also wrote a lot of essays and literary criticism and just sort of commentary on events of the time and so on for the newspapers that he was both working for and briefly had editorship of. And this book is a direct result of the fact that he was attempting to get a lot of his short fiction published in book form, and the publisher at the time had said to him, we don't really think that the American public wants this kind of thing. The American public wants a longer, more coherent narrative that is ongoing. And he had also been receiving complaints, or well, his publishers had been receiving complaints from people saying that his stories were both too erudite and too mystical. And so this was sort of his response to that. And this isn't too late in Poe's writing career. This would be 1838. He has, a good 10 years to go of lots and lots of prolific writing. But he was already experiencing a lot of problems with alcoholism and financial straits. So he really set to work to write this narrative, and supposedly during this time, he put aside the bottle and hardly touched a drop. So what we have here is a very episodic work. Even though it is supposed to be a novel, it sometimes does feel like a collection of 3 or 4 short stories.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
However, this isn't not really uncommon for novels of the time. I do find, Nate, I think you read a lot more classics than I do, and Gretchen might as well, but I think that sort of the idea of everything fitting in cleanly and snugly into this super tight narrative structure with nothing, nothing dangling and nothing out of place. I think that's kind of new, in a way.
I think it depends. There were more concise novels from around this time, but at the same time, I think when Poe was writing this, Dickens was still in his early phase of his writing career, which means he was just winging it for these 800 or 900 page doorstops with no idea where the story would really take him. He would change that later on and plan out a lot of things beforehand and write pre-planned 900-page doorstops, but yeah, his early work is just jumping from one episode to another with really no cohesion between the incidents. So I think this was definitely a pretty common approach that some novelists took at the time.
And a lot of this has to do with serialization too, right? Because, you were writing on a deadline. You didn't necessarily know where everything was going to go. You just had to finish up this part.
Yeah.
Right.
But even with that said, this one has really stuck with me. I know, JM, you've read this before. Gretchen, is this your first time reading this one?
Yes, it is.
I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what it was like, again, reading it for the first time, because I thought this, both times that I read this, was incredibly suspenseful and really powerful in certain scenes. And some of these scenes have really stuck with me over the years.
I think that as a whole, maybe the novel is a little bit fragmented, but it really does feel like Poe really concentrated himself on this. I like Poe a lot. I have nothing bad to say about most of what I've read by him, but I do find sometimes that it takes a while for things to really get started. You don't really know where he's going. He's kind of like strolling around, saying not that much for a while in some of his stories. A lot of them, though, like the really short ones, that's not the case. And this one, that's not the case. This one really, really gets to it right away. And not only that, but the writing is just so, everything is just so clear and vivid. There's not really a lot of, there are some digressions, but I would say they're quite fun, actually, even when he just wants to talk about penguins, which he does. So I'll get started now and tell you how all this goes.
Before we get started with the plot, we should remind you, the listener, that Chrononauts is a spoiler podcast. And for this story, we really mean it. If you have not read this novel before, while we want you to listen to the podcast, we also don't want to spoil it for you, so you might want to skip ahead to our segment on Arctic, as the next novel we'll be covering tonight will also spoil the plot to this one. So you have been warned.
Yeah. So this is ostensibly another of Poe's hoax narratives. We say that now. Apparently, some were sort of taken in, I guess. This is the introductory note is actually from Pym's perspective. And he's telling this story because some gentlemen in Virginia are interested, including a Mr. Poe, formerly of the Southern Literary Messenger. And he may not be revealing some private details, and he also says we should excuse him for potentially exaggerating things or being a bit wild sounding sometimes. It's only natural, given the circumstances, but he really wants to assure us that the story is absolutely 100% true, even if Poe has to pretend it is fiction. It's weird. The narrative is supposed to be by Poe pretending to be Pym as if it were fiction, but it's told to Poe by Pym in reality. So it's sort of needlessly convoluted, but it kind of works. Although it is a little strange because Pym says that at some point he'll actually be taking over the story, and we will be able to tell when this happens because the writing style will be different. And I don't think this ever happens in the book.
I have a couple points where it might, I guess, after the first incident. But yeah, the journal could be another one.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I don't think, you see, this is one of the things that I don't think Poe picked up on. I don't think he, and there is a theory which we'll get into later that he meant this to be longer.
Right.
And it could be that after a certain point, it was just going to be, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say, but it's undoubtedly Poe throughout. Anyway, there's no affectation of whatever Pym might write except as his journal entries. So we begin with a little rite of passage adventure. It's a cute little opening adventure to open the story with that has nothing to do with anything, but it's really neat because it just sort of reminds you of crazy stuff that you do when you're a kid and almost get yourself killed. He begins by telling us how he befriends this Augustus at his school. Augustus is the son of a sea captain. One day, while they're back home, there's a party thrown by Augustus' dad, and a really drunk Augustus decides that he wants to take Pym's shitty little sailboat out in nearly gale-force weather. And Pym doesn't realize how drunk his friend is, and he goes along with it until Augustus passes out and leaves a panicking Pym to run the little boat all by himself. And he thought Augustus was the better sailor, but that really doesn't seem to be true. In fact, Pym, even though he sort of starts by saying he has no idea what he's doing, he seems to really have a knack for this sea voyaging stuff. He loses a sail, but this actually helps him avoid death because, it's not like flapping all over the place responding to the wind, and I guess he can't really control where he's going, but at least he's not in as much danger. He ties Augustus to the deck, and then he hears this awful din and faints to awake among rough sailors on a whaling ship bound back to Nantucket.
The penguin. The
penguin, yes. The first of many penguins.
Yes.
Not just in this book either.
Yeah, so this is our first short story here. A nice little comic tone that is really in stark difference from the rest of the novel, I think.
Yeah. So they get back home at 9 the next day after there's been a massive storm, and they get back home just in time for breakfast, and nobody even notices they've been gone. They're probably really hungover and grumpy. And Augustus and Pym talk about the incident sometimes later with a shudder. Now, Poe has this thing, which I may have alluded to before in our talks of Poe, although I'm not sure because I'm not sure how much it really came up. But he has this thing called The Imp of the Perverse, which he actually wrote a story. Well, he wrote a story of that title, but you can actually see it in a lot of his stories. And essentially that is Poe's definition of perversity, is when you know that something is wrong and you know that you should be doing something else, but instead you do the other thing. And sometimes this could be linked to criminal activity, for example. And the criminal who contains this imp of the perverse in his personality probably wants to get caught in some way. But the imp of the perverse is actually all over this story. So Pym wants to go out to sea now. He has this hankering for wild adventures. But instead of dreaming about fortune and good things and fun explorations and the joy of being on the sea, he's just dreaming about shipwrecks and calamity and disaster. But for some reason, that just makes him want it more. Captain Barnard and Augustus are about to sail with the whaler Grampus, which is being repaired and docked, and his family are dead set against Pym sailing. His grandfather even says he'll disinherit him if he does. But the two wily boys have a plan. He's supposed to rendezvous with Grampus at New Bedford, where he'll be sent by a false note from a supposed relative. They get away with this. And Augustus says it'll be no problem to get him on board, but they'll have to be secretive about it. at first. So on the way to the ship, who should they happen to bump into but Pym's real grandfather? And Pym just pretends to be, I guess, I don't know if he didn't really disguise himself, but I guess he's thinking that his grandfather he's old and his eyesight's not that great, so he just pretends to be this scruffy sailor boy and kind of insults his grandfather, and the two of them run off screaming with laughter. And it's pretty much the last of our comic interludes.
Yeah.
So, on the ship, Augustus takes Pym into his room, and in this very Poe-like moment, he describes how opulent this room is. It's really nice, very comfortable, even a bit spacious for a ship's cabin, only to have a trapdoor open for him, and then Pym's told to climb down. Yep, that's where he's going to spend the first bit of the voyage, in a coffin. In his little space, he's got a mattress covered with books and food and all kinds of cool stuff. And there's a way out, should he need it, and Augustus promises to visit him often. It's mid-June, and the ship is about to set sail. Pym seems quite alright with being buried alive, but Augustus gives him his watch anyway so he can tell how much time is passing. And he says he'll probably be gone a few days. The ship's off, and Pym reads about the expedition to the Columbia River, and the watch doesn't help him much at all, though, because after he falls asleep and he wakes up and it's already run down, and somehow the meat he had before he went to sleep, the rest of it's already gone bad. So it seems like he slept for a really long time. Maybe the air down here is not very good either, and the ship is well off in the ocean by now. And Pym's actually not having a good time anymore. He has terrible, macabre, demoniac dreams, and thinks he's being chased by something, a lion or a demon or something like that. And he wakes up and he's being licked by a dog. It's his dog. Labrador he left behind in Nantucket.
Tiger,
the dog, yes.
Yeah, Tiger's awesome.
Tiger's pretty cool. He drank all his water and ate all his candles, though. Yeah, so Pym really has to get out now. It's feeling terrible, and the ship is pitching and rolling, and the trap won't lift. It's either been nailed shut or something heavy's laying on top of it. The sensations are really bad now, and he makes it back to his little box where the dog is waiting. And he's really good at describing these, horribly dire states of consciousness. He really makes it seem like insanity is just not so far away. It's just always lurking around the corner. And it's at this point that he figures out that a note has been attached to the dog with a piece of string. However, he can't read anything because it's dark and he has no candles. But he can light the scrap with phosphorus matches that he has. Except it seems to be blank. And so in a childish rage, he rips it up. Which is one of many stupid things that Arthur Gordon Pym does. It occurs to him that he didn't read the other side, so maybe there was something on the other side of the paper. Somehow, he's able to piece it all together again. And he's able to pick out a few words. Well, it doesn't really make him feel any better, though, because the only words he can pick out are blood. Your life depends on you lying close.
Very ominous.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds very ominous. Nevertheless, Pym's determined to get out or make himself heard. And this is where Tiger, his faithful friend, suddenly turns on him and attacks him. Maybe the air's just gotten to him, and the dog seems to be going a bit crazy too. There might be another reason for that, which we can speculate on later, but I don't know. Augustus, though, calls him now. He's appeared, but Pym once again has this weird thing in him where he knows he should speak. He knows all he has to do is make himself heard, but he just can't. No voice will come from him. It's so strange, but he describes it in a way that makes you believe in it. Just like, all he has to do is call out. And you know he wants to so badly, but he can't. And finally, though, he knocks something over, and Augustus sort of becomes aware of him, and he has brought some extra food, and now they're sort of sitting together, and Augustus tells him what's been going on the ship. So, essentially, after 4 days, which seems really quick, there's been a mutiny on the ship. And the ruffians on deck, they seem to want to take the ship and become pirates. And they have the loyal men to Captain Barnard are stuck below, and I guess they're hiding down there, essentially. And the men above want to smoke them out. And they seem to be quite brutal men. In particular, there's the cook, who's this big guy who's kind of like, he acts as the executioner. And they tie down some of the men who surrendered and just axe them to death and throw them overboard.
It's a lot of people, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really extreme. And Poe doesn't even really go into why any of this is happening, because it's all from Pym's perspective, and he just doesn't know, right? Maybe Augustus knows, but he doesn't seem to be telling. Maybe they just hired a bad crew. I don't know.
Yeah, one thing I like about this part and this book in general is Poe's able to maintain this really high level of suspense without going into a lot of personal detail about any of the characters. Like,
Yeah.
we see what Pym does, but we don't really know what kind of person Pym is, or some of the other people we're going to meet very shortly. We're just kind of given these sparse details of their actions. But even when Pym is just like lying in the box for a week or so, it's really, really tense. And Poe is great at this kind of writing.
Yeah, definitely. And, I mean, we do get a pretty big chance to speculate about Pym, which we will certainly do in due time. But anybody else really is just... they're pretty much just names, with one possible exception, who we'll get to in just a moment.
Mm-hmm.
So they tire of killing people, and they decide to set the remaining prisoners adrift in a boat. But they keep Augustus on board for the amusement of somebody who seems to have befriended him a bit. This fellow named Dirk Peters. Now, Dirk Peters is a very important figure, and we'll be sticking with him for longer than you might think. I'm just going to read Poe's description of Dirk Peters for you all. It's a really fun... Poe just delights in this grotesque... him and his grotesque descriptions, right? And it's just like, there's quite a few of them here, and this is the first real one we get, and you can just tell that he just relishes doing this so much. Here's what he says about Dirk Peters. Peters himself was one of the most ferocious-looking men I ever beheld. He was short in stature, not more than 4 feet 8 inches high, but his limbs were of Herculean mold. His hands, especially, were so enormously thick and broad as hardly to retain a human shape. His arms, as well as legs, were bowed in the most singular manner, and appeared to possess no flexibility whatever. His head was equally deformed, being of immense size, with an indentation on the crown, like that on the head of most Negroes, and entirely bald. To conceal this latter deficiency, which did not proceed from old age, he usually wore a wig formed of any hair-like material which presented itself. Occasionally, the skin of a Spanish dog, or American grizzly bear. At the time spoken of, he had on a portion of one of these bearskins, and it added no little to the natural ferocity of his countenance, which betook of the Upsaroka character. The mouth extended nearly from ear to ear. The lips were thin, and seemed, like some other portions of his frame, to be devoid of natural pliancy, so that the ruling expression never varied under the influence of any emotion whatever. This ruling expression may be conceived when it is considered that the teeth were exceedingly long and protruding, and never even partially covered, in any instance, by the lips. To pass this man with a casual glance, one might imagine him to be convulsed with laughter, but a second look would induce a shuddering acknowledgment that if such an expression were indicative of merriment, the merriment must be that of a demon. So this is a pretty intense character, and although we won't be seeing too much of his personality in this book, he's kind of ever-present. And one thing that is sort of hinted at here, but which I didn't read that part of it, was he is half native, and so this will sort of come into the discussion a little later on. But, by the way, that name, Dirk Peters, sounds quite naughty, doesn't it? I don't know. I just couldn't help but thinking that because I'm 12 sometimes. But Poe is pretty good at showing us, like his successor, Jules Verne, Poe is very good at showing us the latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates that we are at various points in the novel. So I just noted this down. At this point, we're at latitude 35 degrees, 30 minutes north. So we are actually in very warm waters at this point, near Bermuda. So he's talking about the sailors on the upper decks now who are ruling the ship. They're always drunk, and they seem to have this idea that they want to be pirates. And the mate catches Augustus going to the cabin, so he gets locked up in steerage. And we hear about Augustus trying to get help to Pym, and how divided the mutineers are, because they don't all seem to agree on anything. But to Augustus, Peters seems to be an all-right sort. Anyway, it's been 11 days at this point, and this is where Augustus and Pym reunite down in the stinky hold. So we get a digression from Poe now where he talks about stowage and how the Grampus is very sloppy in its stowage. One thing that's really neat about this book that I really felt was just the danger of being on the sea, and also like how crazy everything is. You can't maintain your footing when the weather's bad. Everything is sloshing around and falling from place to place, and
Right.
it reminded me actually of a story my dad told, because he actually came to Canada from England with his parents when he was a kid, and they didn't do this by plane, they did this by ship. And there was one time where there was actually some very intense weather, and the ship was heaving and tossing from side to side, and all the passengers were supposed to be having a meal in the dining hall, and I guess people were having a very hard time carrying stuff, so things were falling all over the place, and when the ship would lean to one side, all the trays and everything would like fly across the room and just hit the wall on the other side of the room, and it was just absolute chaos. And Poe really makes it seem precarious. Like, after reading this, I was like, it was really exciting, but I did not want to go on the ocean, no.
Yes. It's funny, I actually started this year off reading Moby Dick.
Yes.
And then during my last semester, I read Robinson Crusoe and then this. And what I learned from last year is that I do not want to go on a boat anytime soon.
Yeah, those three definitely have a lot in common with one another, and I think there's some elements coming up that are very similar to Robinson Crusoe, but Poe, like Melville, really focuses on the technology of the ship a lot, and in a way that makes it a sort of proto-science fiction, in that while he's dealing with known technologies, a lot of the focus is on the ship and its maintenance and how things actually work, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, and you can see how Verne was probably excited by that as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get to that later.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, had either of you guys ever gone on a sea voyage?
So I haven't gone out to sea, but I was on a boat that sailed around Lake Winnipesaukee for like 4 or 5 hours. Actually, no, that's not true. I took the ferry from England to France. So that crossed the English Channel, which was a couple miles, but
yeah, that was probably quite calm and sedate and stately. Yeah. So, I mean, I have never been on the sea. I swam in the ocean once, and I really didn't like it. But I have been, when I was a kid, I actually used to go sailing with my dad quite a lot. And he had, mostly on smaller boats, but he had a friend who had I don't remember, it was like a 45-footer or something like that. It's pretty decent boat. So, I mean, it was just cool because it brought back some of that, the memories of that. It was on Lake Ontario, and but he used to go sailing on Lake Ontario a lot, and especially with this one friend who was a Scottish guy. He had like the thick Scottish accent and everything, and I remember it was my 9th or 10th birthday party, he took me and a bunch of friends on the boat, and I got to like use the tiller and everything. That was really cool. So, yeah. Anyway, that's my digression for the day. Tiger seems okay now. Like I said, it's probably just a bad air, or who knows. Bum, bum, bum. The Grampus mutineers. So, yeah, they want to go after the ship from the Cape Verde Islands. They have this idea that they're going to, I guess, capture it and steal all the loot. So Pym's still concealed in the cabin at this point, and Dirk seems to be coaxing Augustus into being some kind of adventurer and explorer. And the mate's party gains ground. So there's two parties. There's the mate and the cook, I think.
Yeah.
And a couple of the cook's men go overboard, and nobody makes an effort to save them. It's pretty casual and quite brutal. And they're trying to find this particular ship to ambush. And when they finally do find the right ship, they're unable to hail her because of the mounting gale. So once again, the weather's getting really bad. And the ship gets badly damaged. And they don't seem too prepared for any of this, really. And at this point, one of the cook's men dies, probably poisoned. And it's a really painful death that involves convulsions and agony. And his body decomposes unnaturally quickly. So we got a bit of a reminiscence of the facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar from last time here. It's really suddenly, like, as soon as it stiffens, it's already starting to decompose. That must have been some really bad poison. I don't know what the hell it was, but holy crap. So, yeah, quickly, by the evening, it's already a disgusting, putrefied thing. And at this point, the cook sort of gives up, and he goes over to the mate's side. And Peters wants to take the ship, though, and he suggests a kind of harebrained-seeming plan. So they don't have much in the way of armaments, and they're definitely fighting against heavy odds, but they start by throwing the watchmen into the sea, or that's the idea anyway, and the mate's party have hidden all the weapons, so it's going to be harder than Peters thought. But Pym disguises himself as the corpse of the man who died, and they throw the real corpse into the sea, and it's really disgusting. But they paint up Pym to look like something from a cover of a black metal album, I guess.
Yeah. It remarks that he puts on a false stomach, whatever that is.
Yeah, because I guess his stomach is all swollen, right? And it's blown up,
bloated.
so it's like really, nasty. We never learned the name of the mate, by the way. And Pym makes a point of saying that he never learned it. It's like, who cares, right? But he's very superstitious and dreads things like the corpse of this guy bumping around in the bottom of the boat somewhere. And at this point, Pym suddenly makes himself known, and the effect is quite startling. Most of them have no idea of his presence on board yet, and of course, he looks like a corpse. So the mate essentially takes one look at him and screams and faints dead away. I think he's dead, right then.
Yeah.
Or maybe he's unconscious and they just throw him overboard. So, obviously he drowns. They just throw him over like a piece of garbage. And the opposition's quickly quelled, and the cook and some other guy are shot. So the cook was actually a really formidable figure. Like, the way he was portrayed was quite scary, actually. But he didn't survive long. So there's only 3 guys left now, and Augustus gets really badly injured. And at this point, Tiger the dog leaps up and starts turning into a attack monster and just sort of rips out somebody's throat.
Yeah.
We get this, heroic dog attack, and Peter strangles a guy. It's really, really intense. Yeah, so there's only Augustus, Pym, Peters, and one other guy, Parker. And because their ship is so badly damaged, all they can do at this point is cut out the mainmast. And they cut off the foremast too, so it's now basically just a floating hulk, and they're hoping that somebody will rescue them. Because the storm really did a number on the ship, and while they were fighting and stuff, I guess, they weren't really tending to their vessel. So it's a really horrible day for them, even though they actually got control of the ship. Augustus has been really badly injured, and by midnight, everything pretty much seemed hopeless. The hatches burst and water starts pouring in. It's really bad. And at this point, too, Tiger just sort of disappears.
Yeah.
And we never hear from him again.
He disappears as quickly as he appears.
Yeah.
Yeah, even quicker.
Right when he has his cool moment, he's out of the novel.
Yeah, no, I think my feeling on that was that he got washed overboard, when the hatches burst.
Yeah, that's my feeling, too.
Pym was just too hurt to maybe mention it or something,
Yeah.
That's kind of my feeling.
Yeah.
Jules Verne has other ideas, but we'll get to that.
We will.
Everyone's lashed to the windlass now, so they're all tied to the deck. Peters has like massive ropes tied right around his groin, and he's bleeding from down there. It's like it made me wince. It's just so like not just that, but just everything is the boat's in danger of capsizing, and you're tied to it because you don't want to move around because you'll probably fall overboard. And it's just like these ropes are being strained so hard, and they're cutting into your flesh. So Augustus seems to be almost dead, but he manages to kind of revive. And the cabin's waterlogged, and there's no food or drinking water above deck. So they try to fish around down there, but it's pretty hopeless. And they can't see anything down there either because it's dark. So after much struggle and anguish, they do find the steward's door locked, and they can't get access. So they see a ship approaching, and they get really excited about it. And we're so optimistic too, and Poe just makes it seem so joyous, like it's such a joyous moment and so glorious. But then we see it's a Dutchman painted black with a tattered figurehead on the mast. And that already bodes very ill. But nobody seems to really notice. Like, nobody thinks of the legend of the Flying Dutchman just yet. The ship seems to be steering oddly, though. Maybe you can't see them. Is it even steering at all? Is the helmsman drunk? Nope. It's a corpse ship. And they first know by the smell as it wafts in their direction. And the bodies they see, including one that appears to be cheerfully nodding and smiling at them, they're totally just cadavers. It's a ship full of rotting corpses. We don't know what happened, but there's birds pecking at the flesh, which sometimes makes them appear to be moving.
Yeah.
But yeah.
This is one of the best parts of the book. What a scene.
Oh yeah. And it's such a vividly grotesque image. Poe doesn't really hold back.
Yeah.
There's a seagull tearing into this guy's back, and the bird flies up and flies over the Grampus and drops this tasty morsel of human innards on the deck of the ship. And the first thing that they think of is, because they're so hungry, first thing they think of is, boy, I'd like to gobble that up. But Pym throws it into the sea, because he can already see the look in Augustus's eyes. Speculation about what horrible fate must have befallen the Dutchman? Well, yeah, there's all kinds. Is it poison? Is it disease? It's a mystery that will never be solved. So they keep shoving poor Peters down into the hull of the ship. He's game for it, because he's game for almost anything, this guy. But their provisions won't be looking too good, like, by the time they get them either, because they're down there, and it's waterlogged, don't forget. So, like, any food that's down there that's not in some kind of sealed container is going to rot, like, really fast. So Pym comes up with a plan of sorts. He wants to go down in steps, and first thing to do is force the door. So they managed to get a bottle of wine. So that's really good, I guess.
3 cheers for the port.
Yeah. But while Pym's going down to conduct the next step, the men up there, they drink the wine. And because they haven't eaten anything in so long, it just takes one bottle of port, and they're pretty much toasted.
Port's strong stuff to begin with, so even on a full stomach, splitting a bottle with somebody will get you there pretty quick.
Not a fan.
Yeah, most people aren't. I don't know. I have a taste for it, particularly from these novels like Port, Madeira, and Sherry. I don't know, they're always drinking it in Dickens, so why not?
Yeah, really. Here we have this guy, Parker, who's the other remaining guy that I haven't mentioned yet, but he's around. And he brings up the idea of cannibalism, the proposal that you knew was coming. And Pym and Parker get into a fight, and Parker tries to kill Pym, but he's too weak to do it. Pym's actually the strongest one now, and it's quite remarkable how Pym started out as this kind of, naive, sort of inexperienced boy, and already he's kind of mastering the situation. Or at least so it appears. But don't forget, this is his narrative, so we don't entirely know, and there's plenty of reason to speculate that Pym might be quite an unreliable narrator. Mm-hmm. So they decide to draw lots. And in a pretty ingenious Poe writing here. So they draw straws, and it gets down to Pym and Parker. And it's a very tense moment. And they actually sit there for several minutes not drawing, because they know this might be the end. And in a nice ironic twist of fate, it's Parker, the one who suggested the whole thing, who draws the short straw. And Peters instantly stabs him in the back, and there is a repast. So, the body lasts them for 4 days, and Poe does not dwell on whether human meat tastes like chicken or pork, but it's pretty horrible, like, from a moral perspective. He kind of shudders at what they had to do. But they also managed to catch some rainwater in a sheet. I guess they don't prepare the body in any way, they just sort of eat it the way it is. I don't know. It's not really gone into. It's like too horrible to contemplate, right? So they get an axe, which they're going to use to cut into the forecastle. And Peters manages to go down and retrieves olives, wine, and ham. And the ham's mostly spoiled, of course. And finally, a Galapagos turtle. How'd they get it up in that condition? I'm not quite sure. I guess maybe they attached a rope to it or something. The tortoise is significant as they carry water in these bags around their neck. Now, it's nearing the end of July, and lots of storms and squalls, and they have to be lashed to the deck. And some of their provisions wash overboard, and they can't get anything else up from the store. Everything else has been swept into the hold, and Augustus has gangrene and is essentially praying for death at this point. Their drinking water's gone putrid, and there are sharks circling. And Augustus expires amid painful convulsions. And they don't have any thoughts of eating that corpse. It's decaying before their eyes as they watch. And it's so bad that they go to throw the corpse overboard, and a leg actually falls off.
Another great gore scene.
Yeah. He doesn't let up, man. And it's very hot. They're probably near the equator at this point. And the hull rolls or heels over, and they narrowly avoid the sharks. No provisions. But, hey, they discover the barnacles are good and nutritious, and they also manage to get some crabs. Finally, in the first week of August, they see a sail, and they are rescued by the British schooner Jane Guy, which is on a trading mission through the South Pacific. Now, we get a real change in the narrative. So this is the end, essentially, of episode 2.
Right.
And we can say episode 1 is the little sea adventure at the beginning. And then episode 2 is the Grampus. By the way, this book, I don't know if it was originally published this way as a book, but it has a really long subtitle that essentially describes everything that happens in the book. So it's a bit of a Simsonia thing going on with that. And there are other similarities to Simsonia here as well. Definitely.
Oh, yes. And we'll get to those afterwards, but yeah.
Yeah. So Pym suddenly seems an experienced seaman. And he's talking about the Jane Guy's impressive speed, but says it's underweight and underarmed and undermanned. And the captain is described as being sort of inept as well. But they are rescued off Cape St. Roque at 31 degrees west. And within just over 2 months, they make it to Kerguelen's Island. Now they're heading far, far to the south, and Christmas Island, where they drop anchor. And Kerguelen's looks verdant, but it's just some saxifrage and moss. And its other name is Desolation Island, which is very fitting.
Yeah. It's in the modern-day French southern and Antarctic lands.
Yes. And there's lots and lots of historical and geographical detail at this point.
Yeah.
Which happens to be mostly lifted from Benjamin Morrell's narrative of 4 voyages from 1832. So Poe was doing his research, and he just kind of wanted to show this stuff, I guess. And it's pretty good. I mean, it passed by pretty quickly for me, but I didn't really record a lot of the detail that he goes into.
No, I didn't either, but it's just kind of interesting that this is pretty much like the southernmost point in the known world at the time.
Yeah. So there's discussions of several types of penguins and other birds, notably albatross, that have a mutualistic relationship with them. It's pretty cool. They do a bit of sealing, but in contrast with Simsonia, it's not all that productive. They still kill hundreds of animals, though. And there's talk of a trio of interesting islands, journeying to the southeast, looking for the famous auroras. Do they really exist? And where are they? Captain Guy wants to find out. They seem hard to locate, and they may, in fact, be illusions. But Guy says they'll carry on south to the pole, just because. In fact, Pym sort of seems to be encouraging him and sort of driving him on. They make it to 71 degrees. Poe talks of the Reynolds expedition at this point, which I think was new at that time.
Yeah.
And just planned. I don't know if that was the one that didn't end up going very far. So it's already March at this point, and there's lots of descriptions of the previous Antarctic expeditions. Now, way at the 75th parallel, there's plenty of ice around, and January 17th, there's a day full of incident, and they take a boat out to a big ice island, where they see this massive bear, and it gets shot, but that only seems to anger him. So Peter jumps on it and stabs it to death. There's land to starboard, and it's christened Bennett's Island, which is, I think, a place that Poe just made up, because by now we're much further south than anyone's gone. So they've penetrated, 8 degrees further than previous navigators. They're running low on fuel, and there's scurvy among the crew. So Guy talks about turning back, but Pym's like, suddenly he's got the captain's ear, and he's saying, no, press on to the pole, for science, for humanity. And it's getting milder. And they're sure there will be fertile land soon. Pym thinks it's all worth it for science, and there's a foreshadowing of deadly things to come, something about bloody details coming. And there's a current that's pulling them to the south, which unnerves some of the sailors, including the captain. But they see strange plants now and animals, things that look very unfamiliar, and a group of large islands, one encased in a sort of reef. And a bunch of men, including Peters and Pym, go out on a boat. And they see some canoes. And there's a group of over 100 natives surrounding the boats, and they are quite bold and well armed. So the chief plops himself right next to the captain on his boat and encourages the Americans, I guess, to be welcome. And 20 of the men get on the schooner and seem to enjoy themselves. They seem to believe that the Jane Guy is a living creature, although Pym isn't so sure that there's no affectation here. And they've never seen white skin before and seem to recoil from the complexion. Some of the men seem amused by the natives' perceived ignorance, but Pym again says that he feels like some of it might be feigned. And they're also unfamiliar with mirrors, and they have strange wariness around certain objects. They don't seem to understand the desire Europeans have for trade, and the chief, Too-Wit, invites the men to his village. And there's much wonderment among the explorers as they see what's about them. Even the water in the streams is odd. It's described as being thick and oily in appearance and being of shades of deep purple, which is
it's their worst album, but it's just, everybody's got to start somewhere.
You think it's their worst album?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe of the Mark III.
I like it. I like the Mark I Deep Purple a lot.
Oh, I do too. The self-titled I like a lot, but I don't
okay.
know. Too many covers on Shades for me, I think.
That's true. But drinkable, though, despite looking strange. So 12 of the guy's men are now on the island hanging out in the village of Too-Wit. And they make speeches to each other that nobody understands. And I had some flashbacks to the air battle at this point.
Yeah.
With the guy, Jagadox or whatever his name was, being taken to the village, the village of the Aboriginals, and they're making this speech, and he's like, yeah, sure, I'll marry one of your daughters, and they're actually talking about burning him alive, but he doesn't know, right? And he's just kind of... Too-Wit keeps emphasizing these words, like Adamumu and Lama Lama. He doesn't want to have anything to do with beads, but he feels like a knife is pretty cool and useful, so he wants that. And he orders dinner, lots and lots of mysterious entrails. And the Jane guys are not into it in the least. So they paddle out to an area nearby where uncountable biches de mer are congregating. And they're kind of like mussels, I think.
Is it sea cucumber? I think it's more of like a sponge or something like that.
Yeah. So they're also promised provisions of duck-like birds and tortoises, which the island is full of. So nothing much seems suspicious, but Pym is foreshadowing, repeatedly, that something bad's going to happen. And there follow several days of peaceful trade, Captain Guy wants to continue south, but establish a curing house on the island for the sea cucumbers he hopes to take back with him. And the natives seem okay with this, but I'm not so sure. Poe inserts a paragraph now talking about the biche de mer and their monetary value in China and the Philippines. And they're going to leave 3 men behind on the island while the rest of the party is to carry on. And they're supposed to have this big sort of going away party. And the lack of suspicion is once again highlighted very suspiciously. And in fact, he pretty much spells out at this point that the islanders, despite friendly appearances, mean them much harm and destruction. And he calls them barbarous wretches. So the natives take the party of 32 men into a narrow ravine where they can be easily ambushed, and as Pym is diverted by a little fissure in a hillside where he can see some nuts and things, there's a massive concussion, and the hill seems to cave in, and Pym and Peters and another guy are nearly buried alive, and they don't see how they'll escape. The third guy, Allan's dead already, and there's a tiny crevice they have to climb up into, where there's light and air coming from. They manage, after much turmoil, to reach the surface, and they see corded stakes driven into the ground, so seems like the natives used some kind of leverage method to collapse the hill and precipitate everything into a gorge. All they had to do was pull, and Pym concludes all the other men must have perished. Peters and Pym can do nothing to warn the remaining men on the Jane, and there's lots of rafts from the neighboring islands have come in, and canoes, and the 6 men on board the Jane are completely unprepared, and although they manage to wreak havoc among the rafts, they are swarmed from the canoes and overwhelmed within minutes. All the men are killed, and the ship is dragged to shore. Tuit comes down to survey the spoils, and Peters and Pym manage to hide out inside their little hill fissure and watch what happens. So what happens is the islanders set the Jane on fire, and lots of people are having a great party, but they don't know that there's ammunition on board and it explodes. So the havoc is mighty. Many, many perish and suffer, and people are running about with excitement, shouting, "Tekalili!" Now, weirdly, they seem almost more focused on finding an animal carcass that Captain Guy had saved up. And it was a thing that I didn't mention before, but they found this strange white animal, and nobody had ever seen anything like it before. And the people of the island seem upset by it. And it's kind of apparent by now, although Pym doesn't seem really to understand or be aware of it, that the color white is just abhorrent to these people. And anything that is of that color is like anathema to them. Peters and Pym are looking for food and are exploring the hills, and they come across some chasms that have mysterious carvings in them. And although the carvings don't seem to mean anything at this point, there's a weird thing at the very end of the book that seeks to kind of explain them, almost. Yeah. It's very odd, probably the oddest thing about the whole book, in fact.
He draws them out in text, too. He doesn't just describe them.
Yeah, so they've now been subsisting on somewhat poisonous nuts for many days, and they have to get out of the gorge. They've been exploring, looking for a way out, and Peter devises an ingenious way of descending by cutting holes into the soapstone and inserting pegs. There's lots of imaginations of falling to a terrible death, and again, the perverse imp rears its head as Pym lets go at the worst possible moment. But Peters does manage to catch him, and they're out and about now. So they're surprised by some natives, and a few get shot and clubbed, and Peters and Pym take one with them. A hostage, a guide, somewhere in between, I guess. And they endeavor to escape in a canoe, smashing the remaining one so the natives who are swarming the beach can't follow. Somewhere south of 85th parallel, they obviously don't really know where they're at. They can't take readings or anything, and I don't think they're really in any condition to. They're in kind of bad shape, actually, like just mentally, psychologically, emotionally, and all that. But it seems to be getting milder, and they think they can find land soon. And the water's very calm, and they turn their large canoe into a makeshift sailboat, and their captive won't assist. He's weirdly afraid of linen, and he shrieks out, "Tekalili!" all the time, and seems to be kind of losing his mind. And only a few pages left, but we've entered a region of novelty. And over the journey, they learn much from the now cooperative captive. His name is Nunu, and they want to know some things about the native people. But obviously, communication is quite difficult. And they ask him why they turned on the Daniers, and all he can do is point to his teeth, which are black. The water is very strange. It's rippling and milky, and Nunu seems adversely affected by something, possibly linen proximity, and he goes into convulsions. And there's no wind, but a steady southward current. The polar vortex, maybe? And the two survivors are calm and almost dreamy, and the water is hot to the touch, and there's strange white stuff falling from the sky. Doesn't seem to be snow, maybe more like ashes. And Nunu's hiding his face in the bottom of the boat, and they say that his spirit leaves his body, so I think at this point he dies.
Yeah.
It's not quite clear what happens to him.
I assume it was due to fright, but
Yeah.
got a heart attack or something like that, you know?
Yeah, it would seem so, yeah. And there's a great cataract, and huge darkness, and all these screaming birds, and into the mouth of the dark curtain, and there's this huge white figure rising up before them. Is it human? And that, my friends, is essentially the end of the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym.
Yeah.
But we do get a note at the end, which is very important because it talks about the lost ending. So supposedly there was more. Poe declines to finish it, and Pym is mysteriously dead somehow. Peters is hiding in Illinois somewhere and can't be reached. It's too bad. We don't have those final chapters about the pole. It'd be really great if we had those chapters, wouldn't it? The government has mounted an expedition there, though, so maybe information will soon be forthcoming. But there's some words, finally, about the chasm figures. It's very strange. Now we see that it does form alphabetical series that's partially in a language that's similar to Arabic, and there's talk of to be shady, and there's also hieroglyphs that resemble to be white, and some Egyptian-looking hieroglyphs that seem to signify the region of the south. And he sort of breaks off there, except there's this weird little epigraph that seems to mean something very significant. We don't know what it means, though, but what it says is, "I have graven it within the hills, and my vengeance upon the dust within the rock." And with that haunting end, that's how we finish. Quite an experience, this book.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Gretchen, this is your first time reading it. What did you think?
I really enjoyed it. The parts where there's that tension is really great, especially the bit with the cannibalism where they're describing the way they're picking the sticks did really get to me. Yeah, I thought it was interesting, and I can see why Vern might want to put his own spin on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you read any other Poe before?
Yes, I have read some of his short stories, Pit in the Pendulum, Black Cat. I've read Cask of Amontillado, a couple of them.
Yeah, Cask definitely feels in some ways similar to some parts of this one where he's just kind of like trapped and like stuck in there. He's really good at that like claustrophobic type scenario. And
Well, he writes about being
Yeah.
buried alive all the time, right? So, and it happens about 3 times in this book that
Yeah.
that characters are buried alive. and you don't know if they're going to get out. I'm not a newcomer to Poe, like even before the podcast, but I haven't read nearly all his fiction yet.
No, I haven't either. I had an anthology that maybe had like a third of it or so, like all the well-known ones and stuff. But yeah, this one sticks out even after several years of having read it for the first time. Some of those scenes, like the Dutch ship and the whole Antarctic bit at the end where they're just trying to escape and fight for their lives. Never mind that like awesome ending of the totally otherworldly scenario and the giant and stuff. It's one of his best, even though structurally it's kind of all over the place and doesn't feel cohesive. But scholars are definitely divided as how to interpret the work for that reason, both the abrupt ending and the kind of disjointed nature of the work. We did take a look at some crit here. I think that Gerald Kennedy's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym and the Abyss of Interpretation really gives a good summary of the extant criticism on the work, as well as a historiography of academic analysis of that. And that's definitely worth taking a look at, I think.
Yes. So before we talk a bit more about the ending, I just want to run down some little thoughts that I might have probably should have put in when we were trying to run through the book. But so Poe is actually really good at describing certain things, and one of the things that I noticed makes sense too is that he's really good at describing states of intoxication.
Yeah.
It's really funny that the way he describes the first couple of chapters they have quite a bit of comic quality to them, and I've said before on the podcast that I think Poe is underrated for his humor.
Yeah.
I think there's quite a lot of it in evidence in some of his stories. It does kind of recede later on, but it's just the way he describes Augustus, his intoxication kind of reminds me of what Rutger Hauer supposedly once said about acting drunk. As an actor, performer, he said something like, well, a lot of people make this mistake. I think probably speaking from his own personal experience, because some people really are like just staggeringly ridiculous drunk, but the way you do it is not by like staggering around and acting like an idiot, but acting like you are wanting to convince people that you are 100% sober when you're totally not. And so all your movements are extremely affected and like you're trying to be super careful, but you're actually sort of the opposite of careful.
Yeah, and Poe is a pretty heavy boozer too, so he definitely had a lot of experience
with it. He had a lot of
it.
personal experience.
Yeah.
Another thing he's good at is he really describes the most minute things and makes them seem very Herculean sometimes. Like, something that would seem really small is just so taxing and so, like, unnerving. Just talking about trying to read this stupid note, It's just, he makes it seem like a life or death struggle, right? And the way they're, like, fishing, they're trying to fish crap out of the hold so that they can have something to eat and drink. It just seems like such a small thing, but it's, like, obviously a matter of survival for them, but it's just like, wow, I mean, it would be so easy. It's right there, but they just can't get to it, It's so good. It's so... The whole thing with the dog is weird, though. Like,
it seems like a really obvious oversight.
Yeah.
And it just, like, sort of shows up, like Augustus kidnapped the dog from Pym's house when Pym didn't know or something.
Yeah.
Like, it's so weird. The characters are sometimes they do unpredictable things, but I guess we don't really get to know them very well anyway. So, but Poe, he also knew a lot about the sea and about like dockage and stuff because he actually did work on a dock for quite some time and was very familiar with stowage. So that's probably why he wanted to talk about it quite a bit, right? And he's talking about it bashing around and stuff, and it's just something that he had some personal experience with. The narrative is, I noticed it's very indirect. There's barely any conversation in this book. Like, I can't think of, usually we just hear about somebody having told somebody something, right? Normally, that's not really something that people want to see in a book, but I think here it works okay. And it does kind of help to bring home the idea that maybe Pym's not the most reliable person to be telling this story. It's just, there's no dialogue, there's no conversations are sort of recounted as though it's well after the fact. So who knows what was really said.
Right.
And And I can sort of imagine it. Like, I actually did imagine, especially the whole second part, it would be a great film or something like that. Like, you could do something really cinematic with it and make it really creepy. Even though nothing otherworldly, or obviously, strange really happens, it's still there in implication and in the atmosphere. I mean, that Dutchman ship, that was really eerie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's some inconsistencies in the text, like weird things like the female tortoise just sort of switching gender partway through and being referred to as a he. But and again, it's there's other things too, like what happened to Tiger. I'm not sure if that was did Poe just forget about him, or did Pym just not want to say that his faithful dog washed overboard? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's both. If we're looking for a real world explanation, it's probably Poe was in a rush and maybe he had too much port that he salvaged from his cellar. But I think an in-text explanation that Pym was so distraught over the loss of his Newfoundland dog that he raised from a puppy that he just doesn't mention it at all for the rest of the narrative. It works.
Yeah, it does. It does work really well. There's obviously something to go into with this whole last part about the race issues.
Yeah, and that is picked up on by a lot of the crit.
Yeah. So, this is something that it does come up in the Vern as well, and we're going to have to talk about that some more. But I think it's interesting the way Poe does it. There's certainly, in the Kennedy, there's a lot of speculation about Poe's, as a Southern gentleman of his time, although he does portray African Americans quite sympathetically in a lot of his stories. I don't think he was an abolitionist at all. And there is even an anonymous newspaper piece that we don't know for a fact was written by him that kind of talks about how important it is for the South to maintain this institution.
Right.
So, I mean, it's kind of iffy. But then he also, because Pym is such an unreliable narrator, I do feel like there's quite a bit of sympathy for the natives sort of covertly on display because, we get told various things. Like, we get told that, the people come to the island and they decide they want to build some curing houses for the biche de mer, and the natives are okay with this. And then they cut down some trees, and the natives are astonished. Like, are they really astonished, or are they, upset and pissed off?
Yeah.
And what I can feel from the whole interaction there in the beginning is that Pym is not really sharp enough to pick up any cues from what's going on. Like, you can't tell if these people are mad or not. That's kind of my feeling, anyway.
Yeah. It seems to me, and it's never really gone into that much, that there's a different tribe down there than the one that they meet that's significantly more technologically advanced. But it's just kind of thrown out there in an offhand way, and we're not even sure if it's actually something that exists. But the tribe that we do meet are a lot more technologically savvy than Pym and Peters and the crew of the Jane give them credit for at first. But they use this technological knowledge in a very duplicitous way to, massacre the entire crew.
Yeah.
And a lot of the crit points out that this kind of potentially tie into Poe's fears of Black people in America feeling the same way, being deathly afraid of white people and whiteness, that the only thing they can do is lash out in violence and destroy everyone.
Yeah. We'll get to this when we talk more about the Vern, but I'd just like to point out that Vern is constantly emphasizing the difference of Dirk Peters between him and everybody else. But at the end of chapter 21 of Pym, for better or worse, Poe calls Peters a white man. So, take that as you will, but it's obvious that to Poe, anyway, even though he describes Peters in a somewhat grotesque fashion, he just does that because he thinks it's kind of fun. He certainly doesn't vilify Peters in any way, and he sort of thinks of him, or Pym at least, thinks of him as one of the guys or whatever, right? So it's sort of interesting the way Vern and Poe seem to handle this a little bit differently.
Yeah. Yeah, they do.
But yeah, Peters is sticking around. I obviously just gave that away. But it's okay, I guess.
Yeah.
There's this, obviously, has influenced a lot of people besides Vern, and there's an interesting connection with The Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah.
So, as some may know, that is also about an Antarctic exploration, and we could have done that in this episode, but there's already a lot of stuff, and I personally probably couldn't have squeezed in another longish novella without straining. So even though I've read it before, maybe we'll do it another time. We certainly got Lovecraft coming up.
Oh, yeah.
But so in that story, they obviously find the remains of the city of the Elder Ones in Antarctica. And they, in fact, find that some of them are still alive, although they have been buried in the ice. And the last image of that story is, it sort of shows, from what I remember, one of these creatures, and he's all alone, and he's sort of standing on this cold mountain, and you can hear this cry that he is uttering into the empty night. And what does he say? He says, Tekalili! We don't know what Tekalili means. I don't know what it meant to Lovecraft, to Poe, or to the natives of Sawal Island. I feel like Tekalili must probably mean like whiteness or something.
Yeah, something like that, maybe.
But it also seems to be a sound that birds make.
Yeah.
So, again, it's one of these weird connections. We don't know what it means. But it's there, it's like one of these weird things to ponder on. The editor of the Gentleman's Magazine, which Poe actually worked for, and eventually actually reviewed this book, and he didn't like it very much. And Poe actually agreed that it was a silly book. He was upset with literary drudgery, and he just tried to he was trying to do this, and I don't know, it didn't seem like he was all that happy with it. So he certainly put a lot of work into it, as was described earlier, but it does seem like he was perhaps a little bit discontent with the result. Maybe that has to do with the fragmented nature. I think that he was much happier working in shorter form.
Yeah, and this is the only novel he wrote.
Yes, he does have another incomplete one called The Journals of Julius Rothman. And that one was partially serialized as well, but he actually never finished it.
Right.
And I've never read it, but most Poe scholars agree that it's quite unsatisfying. But it is in the complete works of Poe, so if you wanted to read it. Now, it's supposedly another exploration journey into the West this time, like the American West or something like that. I don't know. I'm guessing there's not really much that's supernatural about it.
Yeah.
About the ending, though, there's been so much speculation about what it could possibly mean. And I'm just going to read a short quote from Kopley here, who's another person who's written some stuff about this book. And it just sort of summarizes the ridiculously broad interpretation and, I guess, in a way, the frustration that this book has caused people because nobody quite knows what it means. And I think that's actually, I can see why it's frustrating, but I actually like that it's like...
Yeah, and as always, we'll put the citations to all these secondary works in the bibliography section.
So yeah, Richard Kopley notes, he says, Pym's Antarctic apparition has elicited a particularly broad range of explication. It is death, a figure triumphing over death. Knowledge, the limits of knowledge. Goodness, perversity, the imagination, the narrative itself, the white at the bottom of the page, a titan, a divinity, Christ, or Pym's unrecognized white shadow. Self-projection. So, and there's so much, like, it could mean any of those things or none of them. So much speculation about this ending, right? And you can tell that it drove Verne nuts, for example.
So my thought about the ending, and this kind of ties into a larger possible theory I have about the entire work, that he finds himself in Simsonia. And the link between Poe and Simsonia isn't really gone into that much by the crit, with the exception of James O. Bailey, who wrote the introduction to the 60s reprint of Simsonia. But he also wrote a book, Pilgrims Through Space and Time, Trends and Patterns in Scientific and Utopian Fiction, which is cited pretty heavily by David Standish's Hollow Earth book. And he pretty much summarizes the upper level points that he makes. But Pym and Simsonia bear a lot of resemblances to one another. A big part of the Pym plot line is the mutiny. In Simsonia, there's a mutiny brewing, but the captain just kind of shrugs it off by grunting at one of the guys, and that's over. I think what Poe might have done, and there's pretty much documented instances that Poe was familiar with Reynolds, who was one of Sims's biggest advocates. But it's possible, and I'm just completely theorizing this here, that Poe had read Simsonia, and I think, like we did not like it at all and thought it was so boring that a lot of the elements in Simsonia seem to be present here, but inverted. So not only is the mutiny not quelled instantly, but it runs out of control and the entire crew is dead. Instead of finding incredible riches down in the Antarctic at the center of the Earth through the Sims hole, they go to this bizarre place that is much warmer than it should be, but instead they find death and destruction, not riches and fame. And the end, they meet this mysterious being who almost feels like an inversion of a Simsonian itself. In Pym, it's incredibly large and huge and almost like inhumanly massive, where the Simsonians are described as being very small and almost like elf-like, and more sophisticated in the sense that they're like grounded in this culturally advanced society, whereas this being encountered at the end here is totally mysterious and otherworldly and just kind of detached from anything recognizable as life as we know it. So that's kind of my far-fetched theory to add to the pile of the already disjointed crit on it. But yeah, Bailey is really the only one who talks about the links between Simsonia and Pym, and I think there's more to it there, because when you read the two of them, the parallels become pretty, well, maybe surprising for a coincidence, if it's all a coincidence.
Did you think a year from the time we talked about Simsonia, we'd still be talking about Simsonia? I didn't. No. So here we are, still talking about Simsonia. So, I mean, there's a couple of other theories, too. There's this idea that Pym, sorry, I keep calling Poe Pym and Pym Poe, that Pym was metaphorically journeying into the womb and was reborn, and that's why he survived. We don't know what he was doing for 11 years. Like, the journey written about in the book only takes a year's time. So there's 10 years that we don't know anything about. There's also Eakin's discussion of what Poe is doing here. So he says that Pym dies and survives simultaneously, and this is part of Poe's obsession, which he writes about again and again. Everything from the humorous story that I mentioned in probably the episode we talked about Monsieur Valdemar, How to Write a Blackwoods article, where the editor of the magazine tells a girl that she should drown herself so she can talk about what it feels like to drown and die. And in Valdemar, they mesmerize somebody on the point of death so he can relay the experience of what it's like to die. So here is Pym going through this experience of coming to the end of the world and dying and being reborn. So it just seems to be something that Poe wrote about a lot and that he was really interested in, which I totally understand. It's a fascinating thing to wonder about, right? Yeah. And I don't know, Poe himself died pretty young, so it could be he had premonitions of where he was going from a pretty early age. It seems like he was that kind of person. So
yeah, a lot of weird coincidences with this one too. There's also the real life coincidence of Richard Parker.
Remind me, I'm getting him confused with a character in the book, and now I can't think of what.
Yeah, so in 1884, a yacht sank with 4 men who were shipwrecked. And after a few weeks, they decided that one of them should be sacrificed so the other can live, just by, the cannibalism. So what was the name of the person who was killed and eaten? Richard Parker.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so it was, so it is related to that character. Okay.
Yeah, but just totally coincidental. This was a real-life incident, and it's not like they were role-playing or something like that. But yeah, it really bizarre stuff.
And it does seem like in the 90s, the politics, according to Kennedy, really took over the discussion of this book, specifically the race issues.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising. So yeah, I mean, there is quite a lot of contradiction here, too. There's talk of, like what we were saying, where this John Carlos Rowe talks about Poe's racism and his fears of slave rebellion and so-called black savagery. And he goes into Poe's Southern heritage and his fear of the passing of the old institutions. I mean, I always thought, until this time anyway, it seemed like I never really thought about that, and I thought that Poe was quite fair in his depictions for his time, and he certainly avoids a lot of the language and a lot of the
He does, yeah.
outright overboard racism that we saw in the Edisonade episode.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be talked about the depictions of the natives and all that, but it's nowhere on the level as the stuff from the last episode, which is just totally unabashed, uncritical racism and imperialism. And I think Poe, while that's certainly there, it's not like the point of the novel, I don't think, anyway.
No. There's one final thing that we have to say, and maybe this could tie in with Poe's low opinion of the work, maybe not. Maybe it's meaningless. Maybe there is no interpretation. I mean, obviously, the work speaks for itself, so there can't really be a right or a wrong anyway, but, like, maybe it really means nothing. Poe has this short story called Mystification, which Manila Road fans will know.
Yeah.
And the story basically describes how these two academics, this one guy insults the other for his opinions, and they decide to sort of have a duel, but the duel itself never happens in the story, and what it all comes down to is that this older sort of Hungarian academic of the Baron von Junz is totally befuddling this German guy, Hermann, by essentially giving him, like, faulty Latin texts to dissect that are completely meaningless. And this younger guy is so obsessed with looking smart and seeming like he knows everything in the world that he will not admit that he's completely bamboozled. And Poe himself is a bit of a bamboozler.
Oh, yeah.
His love of the hoax, which we've talked about before. It's too bad that Mark Twain is from the next generation, because I feel like they would have gotten along pretty good.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I personally am very happy with the way this ends. I like the fact that we're still talking about it because we don't really know what it means.
Yeah, I like the ending a lot.
Yeah, I like the ambiguity of it.
Yeah, Gretchen, you and I have talked about this before, that you are quite enamored with ambiguity in general in a lot of things, right? As long as it's well depicted.
Yeah.
And what a final line to go out on. Not the postscript, but the final line in the main part of the narrative. I mean, Poe really saves the best for last for you.
The final line. I didn't note that. Do you want to read the final line? Do you have it handy?
So I guess the final two lines. But there arose in our pathway a shrouded human figure, very far larger in its proportions than any dweller among men. And the hue of the skin of the figure was of the perfect whiteness of the snow.
Oh, man. Yeah. It's so good. It's
Yeah.
such a nice, like, it's, yeah, it's very atypical for Poe to end in that kind of fashion, because he's usually quite clear in wrapping things up, but no, it's perfect. I like it for what it is, and I think that's what, even though it may have frustrated a lot of people, I think we can all agree that it's good this way. And it could have been longer. It seemed like maybe he wanted to be longer, but the rest never happened. So the book didn't sell very many copies when it first came out, and I guess it didn't do well enough, and Poe just sort of moved on to other things. So if he ever intended to continue it, we'll never know.
Yeah, I got the sense it was never popular during his lifetime and only experienced
No.
a critical resurgence in the decades following his death.
Supposedly by 1839, it had only sold 100 copies.
Yeah.
So for Poe, who was already somewhat known at the time, it's not so hot. All right. I think we will move on to one of Poe's successors, somebody who was probably quite driven a little bit nutty by what he deemed the inconclusiveness of Pym. Pym's narrative, which we have no doubts about what he thought. We know he liked Poe a lot. We also know that he was very frustrated by the ending of this book, and he had it in his head that he was going to do something for himself. He was going to fix it. At least that's my interpretation. We'll see what you guys think when we come back.